Hi, I'm Dr. Emma Diaz. I am so glad you're here. So glad I'm here. I want to talk to you a little bit today about narrative exposure therapy, also called NET. Narrative exposure therapy is one of my favorite trauma treatments. It is my favorite trauma treatment. I don't know if I'm allowed to have a favorite, but it's mine. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about who typically benefits from NET the most, what NET even is, and the benefits that I often see when folks complete NET. Let's first talk a little bit about what NET is. NET is a trauma treatment that's designed to help people process the painful, traumatic, and positive things that have happened in their life. NET does have some solid research, and it is one of the therapies that is oftentimes recommended for PTSD or complex trauma. When folks meet with me to do NET, it's typically a 2 to 3 step process. I have a visitor. Eat a boy, Bruno. The first step is to create a timeline of all of the painful, traumatic, and positive things that have happened in your life. During the timeline, you don't go into a lot of depth of what happened. You're just naming off the different events that have happened. The second part is where you actually start writing about what happened, and we start talking about and processing what happened. Depending on how many events you have, you'll write about the first few things on the timeline. You can write about them however you want, in whatever ways you want. And you come back, you read it aloud during session, and then we talk about it. What was it like to write about it? What was it like to read it out loud? What did you feel when you were doing it? What did the memory feel like from what you remember? Tell me more about it. And we talk through in depth the painful, traumatic, and positive things that have happened in your life. So many folks describe this letting go process. It's not that you forget about the traumatic things that have happened to you. But so often when you have trauma, it feels like you're carrying these invisible briefcases full of these bad things. And when you have a chance to talk them through and process them through with narrative exposure therapy, you're finally starting to set down those things. You're making sense of them, you're organizing the memory, and you're putting the past in the past. It can still bother you, it can still impact you, you're still going to think about it, but the goal is for it to bother you less. At the end, you talk about what would you title this story of your life? Who would you dedicate it to? What do you want to write into your own future? So you're summarizing where you've been and you're starting to think about where you want to go. Narrative exposure therapy is a way to do several things. One is to get some exposure to the things that have happened to you so you can finally start to make sense of those memories and organize them. The second thing it does is it helps you to take a broader perspective. So often when we have traumatic things happen to us, it feels like that is all of who we are and it encapsulates all of us. NET allows us to think about positive things and painful things. And it reminds us that this really, really bad traumatic thing that happened to you is only one piece of this much, much larger story. It also allows you to identify patterns in your life. Folks start to realize that they are reenacting patterns that they didn't know, or they start to identify patterns that they didn't know were there. And they can see them because we go through each time period. You start to develop insight into why some times are harder than the others, or why sometimes feel easier. The timeline part can be really difficult because you're talking about thing after thing after thing. A lot of folks feel exhausted by the time that they get through with it, but they also feel validated. So many of the folks that I meet with come in and say, I don't know why I feel this way. I should be over it. Why can't I just get over it? And when they have a chance to go through the timeline, they finally have this moment of, aha, here is why. There are so many things that have stacked up on top of each other, and it helps them to understand why they react the way they react. Why things bother them, because there's actually a lot more that's happened than they initially realized. Let's talk a little bit about the types of people I see benefit the most from narrative exposure therapy. One of the reasons I love narrative exposure therapy is because I've seen it help people who've tried different types of trauma therapies without success. I've seen people who've tried EMDR, who've tried prolonged exposure, who've tried CPT, and they come back and they feel like they haven't made the progress that they've wanted to. So many of those folks really benefit from this therapy. And one of the reasons they benefit is because they have an opportunity to talk about a lot of things that have happened in their life, not just one thing. I also see people benefit from narrative exposure therapy who have complex trauma. They have a lot of things that have stacked up through their life. And sometimes they don't have one big event that's happened, but they have a lifetime of smaller events that they feel like shouldn't bother them, or a lifetime of smaller events they think should bother them. Maybe their parent engaged in substance use and was never there. Maybe their parent was emotionally abusive or neglectful. And there are all of these events that stack up and stack up and stack up. Narrative exposure therapy has been incredibly helpful for folks like that. There's a few benefits of narrative exposure therapy compared to some of the other therapies I practice. One thing is that it is really directed by you. You write about what's important, then you read it, but really what we process is based on what I as the therapist notice, but also what you as the writer and liver of your life notice. What sticks out to you when you read through this? What do you notice come up for you? And so it really is based on the things that are most important to you. Another benefit is that you can go over so many different things in your life. With EMDR, I generally recommend folks go through 4 to 6 things because you're processing one event over and over and over. And most folks don't want to do trauma therapy for 3 years of their life. They want to do the therapy and move on. Trauma therapy is hard and it's work, and I don't recommend doing it for longer than a year or 2. Narrative exposure therapy lets you go into several different events and think about things that aren't just traumatic but are just painful, but have had a significant impact on your life. If there are a lot of things you want to process that you haven't been able to process in the past, narrative exposure can be a really good therapy for that. Another benefit that I see with narrative exposure therapy that I don't see with a lot of other therapies is that you get a session to talk about the thing. Occasionally I'll have someone rewrite something, not often, but occasionally you'll spend 2 sessions on it and then you move on. And I think it also reinforces this idea that you are bigger than the worst thing that has happened to you. It reinforces this idea that you have a whole life to process, not just a single thing to process. I love narrative exposure therapy. I've seen it help so many people who've been left behind before. If you're interested in it, please reach out and I'm happy to talk with you more about whether it might be a good fit.